Hello, and welcome to this edition of Scientists in Action, How Our Brains Learn. Very excited to present to you today. But first, I would like to say that the Denver Museum of Nature and Science respectfully acknowledges that the lands we are on today are the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations and people. We also acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to these lands that are now called Colorado reside in the American Southwest, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountain region. Thank you. So I'm your host, Asa Erlandson. A few housekeeping things before we get started and learn about how brains learn is that we have some schools joining us on camera. Very excited to hear your questions. Please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off until we get to the question and answer part. For the rest of our schools joining us, please do put your questions in the chat room. We are going to do our best to answer as many questions as we can and to satisfy your curiosity because today's topic is so interesting and we are very fortunate to have our scientists with us, Dr. Melanie Peffer. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to our special guests to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Melanie Peffer. Thank you for being here today. I'm super excited to spend the next 45 minutes with you talking about learning and how we learn. And I'll talk a little bit more about myself in a minute. For now, we have 2 polls.
That's right. We're going to bring up a couple polls for you and consider these polls a warming up of your brain. All right. We're going to stretch our thinking a little bit to explore a question that maybe we don't already know the answer to, and that's totally fine. But see what ideas you come up with, maybe individually or with your classmates. So our question is, how much does an average human brain weigh? And you have a few options here, one of which is, I have no idea, which I'm not participating in the poll, but that's the answer I would put. I'm not even sure where to begin. I know it fits inside my head, but that's about as far as my thinking can take me on that one. So we're looking forward to seeing what answers our guests come up with. And the answers are slowly coming in. There might be some deliberation going on in our classrooms. Is it 1 pound, 2 pounds, 3 pounds? Those are our options. And then, of course, I have no idea. And I'm glad to see we have at least one person saying, I have no idea. So go ahead and take a few more moments. I think we have a couple more guests that maybe are deliberating. So another 5 seconds or so, and then we'll close our poll and share the results. All right. So it looks like a lot of our guests said 1 pound. One said 2 pounds. And one of our guests said, I have no idea. So Dr. Peffer, what is the answer to this question?
The answer to this question is it's 3 pounds. So
3
if you
pounds.
didn't get it right, that's fine. It's an opportunity to learn, but our brain weighs about 3 pounds, the size of a toaster.
Size of a toaster. Awesome. So that was our first brain warm-up for you, my friends. Our second one is going to involve some bigger numbers. So we went from 1, 2, and 3 pounds, and now we're asking how many neurons or brain cells are in the average human brain. And now we're dealing with millions and billions. And this is one where I really have no idea. So it could be, you know, I'm not even sure where to begin. I'll let our friends do their own puzzle piecing for this one. So go ahead and put your best guess, your hypothesis. All right, the answers are coming in. Give a few more moments for our remaining participants to give us their answers. All right, and we'll go ahead and close out that poll and share the results. Let's see what they said. So a three-way tie between 500 million, 24 billion, and 86 billion. I don't know the answer to this question for sure. Dr. Peffer, what do you think of the results that came in?
I think that it's great that everybody was willing to try something new. So our bodies in general have about 3 trillion cells, and a lot of those cells can be found in our brain.
There's 3 trillion cells total, or 3 trillion?
Total, 3 trillion cells in your entire body.
So if the brain has, say, 50 billion cells, that is a huge portion of all those cells.
Exactly. Yep.
Incredible. All right, well, those are our brain warm-ups for our guests. Now, Dr. Peffer, the show's yours. We can't wait to hear what you have in store for us.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So first I want to just talk a little bit about what I do. So I actually have 2 different science jobs, which is really fun. The first science job that I have is that I'm a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so professors do 2 things. We teach. So this is a picture of me teaching in my classroom that I teach in every week. I also teach online. So I have 2 online courses that you can take for free. And I also do research. And so I'm interested in how people learn and understand science and biology. Because I do learning sciences research, I spend a lot of my time doing research in a classroom, as well as sitting on my computer. So I do data analysis at my computer, looking at the results of experiments. I write up my manuscripts, and I also submit grants, which are requests for money so that I can do research. When I have results, I go to conferences. So this is a picture of me at a conference presenting my research. So that's one of my science jobs. My other science job is that I'm an author and a writer. So I have 2 books that I've published. One is called Biology Everywhere. So we get a little taste of biology everywhere today. I've also written a children's book called On the River. People hire me to come in and write for them or to teach people how to write about science. And so that's the other sciencey thing that I do. So this seems like 2 very different jobs, and I'm talking about 2 different disciplines of science. So I work with biology and I work with psychology, which is what the learning sciences is, and I'm an educator too. How do we bring all of this together? So everything that I do comes back to this one question: how can I help make biology accessible? So what do I mean by make biology accessible? So this could be, how do I help people understand how biology relates to their lives, or see the relevance of biology to their own life? How do I help people understand how we learn biology? How do I then translate what we know about human learning into a classroom so that people can learn biology in the best way possible? So I'm going to give 2 examples today of how I make biology accessible. And the first is helping people find biology everywhere. There's so much science around us every day, and sometimes it's just a matter of knowing where to look to see it. And so the example I'm going to give today has to do with art and biology. So in the chat window, I'd love to get to know you all a little bit better. So do we have any artists or musicians here today? And if you're an artist, tell us about your medium. Are you a painter? Do you like to draw? Do you like to sculpt? Do you like to take photos? If you're a musician, do you play an instrument? Do you sing in a choir? Tell me about what you do.
So go ahead and share your answers in the chat there, about your art, whether it's music or poetry, sculpture. There's so many different art forms. We would love to hear about any and all of them. And the answers are coming in. We've got singers, dancers, someone or some folks play guitar. We have people that draw, play piano, sculpting. A few people play piano. So pretty good breadth of different kinds of creativity going on in our chat room right now. Oh, someone does stop motion. That is awesome. That is a little few people. That's few people do that art form now, I would say.
That's awesome. So I love that we have a lot of arts or musical people here today. So when I was growing up, we were told that you could either be an artist or you could be a scientist. And maybe some of you have heard this, maybe not. So the students earlier today were saying that they haven't heard that message. Maybe that message is finally starting to go away. But for those of you who maybe have heard it before, I'm going to tell you a story today about a scientist. And this is the scientist in question. His name is Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And he really wanted to be an artist when he grew up. But his dad said, no, you can't be an artist. You can't make a living as an artist. You have to go be a scientist instead. And so he went to school for science instead, but he never lost that passion for art. And so what he would do is that he would look at slices of the brain, those neurons that we talked about in our warm-up exercise. He would look at them under his microscope, so you can see his microscope sitting there, and he would draw pictures of what he saw under the microscope. And so here's an example of one of his drawings of neurons. And as he drew pictures of neurons and kept drawing them and kept drawing them and kept drawing the pictures of the brain, he came up with an idea. And that idea is called the neuron doctrine. That's what we call it today. And his idea was that the brain was made up of individual cells called neurons. Now, at the time he was making his drawings, people thought that the brain was just one big thing all connected together. It wasn't individual pieces. It was just one large object. And so his idea that the brain is made up of neurons, he actually went on to win the Nobel Prize for it. And it's still accepted today. So as time has gone, there's been more and more data that agreed with what he figured out through his art, that the neuron is the functional unit of the brain. And so we're not going to watch this video right now, but I included a link to it in the teacher materials that come with today's presentation. So you can watch it in your classroom another time and explore more of Kael's story. Now, Kael wasn't the only biologist artist or the only artist to make their impact on biology. So these two paintings here are done by John Audubon, and Audubon set out to paint every bird in North America. So the first image on the left that I've included is one of my favorite birds, the roseate spoonbill. And so in the spring, when it's time to get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, they turn bright pink, those beautiful pink birds. And then they have that spoon-shaped bill that it uses for catching its prey. So they use it to dig around in the mud to find what they're going to have for dinner. Another one of his paintings is the Carolina parakeet. So Carolina parakeets are extinct now. They were overhunted because people wanted their feathers for making hats. And now we don't have them. But at least we have this representation of the Carolina parakeet that Audubon had put together. Another example of an artist who is also a biologist, who we usually don't think of as a scientist, is Beatrix Potter. So I'm guessing many of you have read The Tale of Peter Rabbit or about Squirrel Nutkin. That's the other image I have here. And so when Beatrix Potter was a young girl, she had a sketch pad that she would carry around with her, and she would draw pictures of things that she found out in nature. And so as she got older and kept drawing her pictures, similar to Kael drawing pictures, is one of her favorite things to draw was mushrooms. And so looking under her microscope and looking at mushrooms, she came up with data and the idea that mushrooms come from spores, just like plants come from seeds. And so she wrote up her findings in a paper like scientists do, but she wasn't allowed to present her research to other scientists because she was living in the late 1800s and women weren't allowed to be scientists then. And so someone else presented her research and the other scientists liked it, but it never sat well with her that she couldn't be the whole scientist herself. And so she went on and published The Tale of Peter Rabbit instead. And of course, Peter Rabbit's become a household name, as has Beatrix Potter. And now that, we're more accepting of women in science, her work is coming to light now, which is exciting. So if you're somebody who's artistic who also really likes science as well, one of the things that we really, really need right now in society is people who can use art to tell science stories. So here's some examples of where people have told science stories with art. So this is images from a friend of mine, and she uses bacteria to make pictures. And so basically she takes bacteria on a sterile toothpick and draws a picture and then lets them grow up. And so we see the pictures that she is able to generate using living organisms. Another example is with the photo arc. So Joel Sartori is a photographer with National Geographic who has set out to document all of the world's animals. And so when we think about conservation or saving different environments and saving different animals, people often think about tigers or elephants, these large, beautiful, charismatic creatures, and forget that the real tiny creatures or the ones that maybe aren't quite as appealing, such as snakes to people, have just as much reason to be preserved and valued. And so he's gone out to take studio photographs to not only document endangered animals, but also to help people build a connection with the animals so that they care more about them, more interested in saving. So this is an example of how photography can help with conservation biology. It also helps with education and awareness. So if you look very carefully at this picture of the waves, you'll see that it's made out of trash. So it's made out of plastic that was picked up off the beaches to raise awareness about plastic pollution in the environment and try to get people to stop using single-use plastics. So art can be a really effective form for enacting change and getting to justice. And of course, music's included here too. They Might Be Giants put together this album several years ago now called Here Comes Science. Okay, so that's one way that I help people understand biology, understand the importance of biology in their life. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about my research area, which is how people learn biology. And I specifically went with examples of how we can apply how we learn biology into the classroom. So to leave you with some tips today of how best you can learn in the classroom. So we all know science is awesome. If you're here, I think we just know that we like science, but our science class is easy. And unfortunately, science gets a bit of a bad rap for being a very hard class, even though it's awesome. So what do we do about that? Why is it that science is awesome, but it's also hard? So this, I think, is a very illustrative example of that. And so if you look on the left side of the screen, we see this very complicated looking molecule. And so that's a carbohydrate. We also call carbohydrates sugars. And this particular sugar makes long lines, like what's shown in the bottom photograph. And then these lines stack on top of one another like Lincoln logs. And so because it can stack up like Lincoln logs, it makes this molecule very, very, very strong. And so what's this molecule? It's cellulose. So cellulose is made by plants, and it's the most abundant molecule on the planet because we have so many plants. And so one of the things that we see is cotton. So cotton is made up of cellulose. Because cellulose is so strong, that's why we use it to make our clothing. So many of you may be wearing that complicated molecule right now if you happen to be wearing a cotton t-shirt. Because cellulose is so strong, this is also why we build our houses out of wood as well. So it can be really hard to connect what we're doing in the classroom to the real world applications. So how can we make this easier? How can we learn better? And so I have what I call the learning cycle. A lot of different people have many different variations of this. Some people call it the study cycle. Sometimes the study cycle has 7 steps. I like this simple 3-step method that I call the learning cycle. And so I'm going to talk about each part of the learning cycle and what's going on in your brain that helps you learn your material as you move through this process. This is also a process that you can do as part of your own learning to help you be successful in the classroom. So it starts with previewing. Previewing is something we do before we go to class. Your teacher might assign you a preview assignment that you need to do before you come in. And what previewing does is that it gives your brain a big picture of what's going on. So what are we doing today? It's like if you're going on a hike or you're going to a new place, you look at the map first to get a big idea of what's going on. So how do you preview before you come to class? It could be an assignment that your teacher gives you. It could be that you read the book. It could be that you flip through the book and get an idea of what's going on. If you have PowerPoint slides, look into the PowerPoint slides. Basically, you want to get some familiarity with what's going on so that when you come into class, it's easier to understand. It's also our first repetition. Repetition is something we're going to talk a lot about today. When we see the same information over and over again, it makes really strong connections between those brain cells, our neurons, to help us remember the information. So this is our first repetition, and we get our second repetition when we go to class. It's also less overwhelming, as if we're really anxious and worried in class because we don't know what's going on. It makes it hard to learn as well. Whereas if you have that previous step before you come to class, you're less overwhelmed in class. It's easier to listen to your teacher. All right, so that's previewing. The next step is called understanding. So understanding is when we take information and move it from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. So short-term memory is short. It doesn't exist for very long. It allows us to remember a phone number, for example, long enough to be able to dial it in, but not much beyond that. And so if we're in school and we're learning very important things, we need to be able to remember it, right? So we need to move it into our long-term memory. So you can think of this as storage in your brain. And you can store memories as long as your entire life. And so if we want to make the most out of being in school, we want to put that information into our long-term memory. So how do we do that? So here's 3 study strategies that you can use to put information into your long-term memory. Each of these study strategies have been extensively studied by other learning scientists. And so we know we have a lot of evidence that these are the best ways to study. So the first way is called elaboration. So that's when we take something that new that we're learning and build onto it. And so if we think about how memories are stored in our brains, people who study memory talk about memory networks and how different things are connected to one another. And if we can take our new information and connect it to those other memories in our brain by elaborating on it, we'll remember it better. So take my cellulose example, and then we can elaborate on that and connect it to using wood to build houses. And so now it's connected to another memory, which helps us remember it better. Self-explanation is another really good one, or self-teaching. So if your teacher, for example, has you work in groups and you have to explain things to each other, that's helping to put this in your long-term memory. It's a different skill to be able to explain something to someone else. I actually have to teach it to someone else. And you get repetition there as well, activating more parts of your brain. And so it helps you to remember it better and put it in your long-term memory. One of my absolute favorite study strategies is called dual coding. So dual, of course, means 2. And coding or encoding is the process of actually making memories and putting them into your long-term memory. And so one of the best ways to get something into our long-term memory is to do it in 2 different ways. So this could be you write notes and words, and then you draw a picture of it. Something that I do with my students is I give them Play-Doh on the first day of class, and then we build models of the things that we're talking about in class and then explain them. So this picture here is a model that one of my students made this semester, showing how DNA, which is the information in our cells that makes us, gets copied, because we need to be able to make DNA copies. And so he's got the Play-Doh on the pipe cleaners, and he's got the little pom-poms, and all of these represent different molecules that are important in the process of making copies of DNA. So why does this work? Well, in our brains, we have language centers, and we have auditory centers, and we have visual centers. And so when you are moving things with your hands and manipulating them, as well as explaining it to someone else, you're activating more parts of your brain at once. The more parts of the brain you activate, the more likely you are to remember it. The brain is very active, and so it's building stronger, more durable memories. Okay, so now we've talked about putting things into our long-term memory. We're going to get to our third part, practicing. Now, practicing can be the trickiest part because if you've ever taken a test and studied really hard for it, but didn't get a good grade, it's almost always because you didn't practice it. So before we get into an academic example of what it means to practice, in the chat window, I want you to think about a non-academic, non-class example. What would happen if you showed up to a hockey game or a soccer game or a baseball game, whatever you want, and you never went to a practice? What would happen at that game? For those of you who are musical, what would happen if you came to the concert but never practiced your instrument? What would happen?
All right, so yeah, we've got a couple questions. Might imagine this situation for yourself, or maybe you've been in this situation before. So, and some answers are already coming in. So a good variety too. We have, you would be off key. So in the world of music, you might not, yeah, you'd be off key. You would feel scared, regardless of the thing. Feeling nervous, embarrassed, some different emotions would come up. And then one person is saying you wouldn't do very well. You might not know what to do or forget what to do. And let's see here. You would fail. You wouldn't know what's happening. So without practice, doesn't seem like you wouldn't do well. I think that one kind of summed it up.
Yeah, exactly. So it brings up a lot of these more negative emotions. We feel embarrassed, we feel anxious or worried, and we wouldn't do very well. So we could all kind of imagine this situation where we go in and we don't practice, or we're just not prepared, and it doesn't go well. And so it's the same thing in the classroom. When we want to learn new material, we have to practice it. Just like we'd practice an instrument, just like we'd go to soccer practice and do drills. And so I think it's also easy to sit here and be like, oh, if I go to hockey practice, we're going to practice skating. We're going to do this practice and practice shooting the puck. Or if I'm going to play my instrument, I'm going to get my flute out and I'm going to play some scales and I'm going to maybe do some long tones to get ready to play. But what do we do in the classroom? What does it mean to practice to learn something? Okay, so here's another analogy. So imagine that your brain is like this library here, and that those memories stored in your long-term memory are like the books on the shelf. So we work through the understanding process because we want to make sure we have all these memories, all these books on the shelves here for us to use. So what practicing means is that you practice going and getting that book off the shelf and using the information stored in that book. And so if you think about this, the more you go and retrieve a book off the shelf, the more times you do it, the easier it gets. It's more automatic. You don't have to think about what section is cellulose in? Where do I find carbohydrate information? You're like, oh, it's right there. I'm going to go get it, and I'm going to pull that information off my bookshelf and use it. So this is called retrieval practice. We're retrieving our memories. And so I have the example of the dog here. It's not my dog. I'm a cat person, so I don't have a dog. But you see he has a toy. And so we've all been out and thrown a tennis ball or some other kind of toy for the dog. And the dog runs and gets it and then brings it back to us. So that's what retrieving means. And it's the same thing with our brains as well. We need to go and get those memories out of our long-term memory and retrieve them so that we can use them. How do we use them? Doing practice problems out in the real world. So that example with cellulose and a t-shirt, no one taught me that. It was just me being able to apply that information from the classroom into the real world. And so this also highlights the importance of going through these steps in order, because if you don't have that information in your long-term memory, you can't retrieve it. If you don't have the book on the shelf, you can't go get the book off the shelf. And so if you've ever tried to do homework and you keep having to flip back through your notes to look things up, that means that you haven't moved that information into your long-term memory yet. So you can't use it if you don't have it. So how do we do retrieval practice? This can be doing practice problems, practice tests, or if you're not in a class where there are a lot of practice problems, what you can do is study for 10 minutes, close your notes, and then write down everything that you remember. Anything that causes you to get those memories out of your long-term memory will help you be able to remember it better and be able to use it. Because at the end of the day, we want to use the things we're learning in school. Because if it's not something that's useful, why are we learning it in the first place, right? Okay, so I want to thank you all for paying attention today and for coming out, and remind you that if you want to learn something new, make sure you preview it, understand it, or put it in your long-term memory, and practice retrieving it. If you're more interested in the work that I do and my research and my books, anything else, feel free to check me out on the web or follow me on any of the social media channels below. And with that, I am happy to take your questions.
All right, awesome. So much interesting information to visit. I'm sure the questions are bubbling up in our classrooms. if we could check in first with our French American School of Denver and get some questions from your classroom about, I mean, so much. There's so much we've been talking about with learning and the brain. So it looks like you're muted right now. Go ahead and unmute your mic. And then we would love to hear what questions you have.
Thanks so much.
Hello. My question is it possible to make an artificial brain that can actually work in a person?
Ooh, that's such an interesting question. And it's a question I think people have been asking for a long time. I was actually just talking to someone who didn't believe me that people have been talking about artificial intelligence since the 1950s. And she's like, oh, people didn't have personal computers. You can have artificial intelligence. But no, that's when the first, when Alan Turing published his paper about the Turing test, to be able to tell if machines can have consciousness. So people have been talking about artificial intelligence and making artificial brains for a long time. We're seeing more and more artificial intelligence every day. So if you've played with something like ChatGPT before, so that's called generative AI, generative artificial intelligence, where you give it a prompt and it generates a picture or information based on what you get it. So can we now? Probably not. Will we in the future? Maybe. The cool thing about science, we don't know what we'll expect, but people have been talking about artificial intelligence for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ross.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. What do we have next?
Our question is, does your brain evolve as you get older?
Ooh, that is a good question. So how does our brain change as we get older? And so this is most obviously seen with babies because their brains change so rapidly. We see it a lot with teenagers too. So that one of the greatest period of change for your brain, other than before you're born, is actually when you're a teenager. Big changes happen in your brain. And so we go back to talking about babies. When babies are first born, they can't do very much. And they don't understand that they're different from their mom, basically. That's why babies like to be held so much when they're really little. And they don't understand that they're different. And as they gain more skills, that's shown in how their brains are also changing at the same time. So those new skills, being able to develop those new cognitive skills, of being able to speak, all has to do with changes happening in the brain.
Great question. All right, let's get another question from the French American School.
Hi. My question is, if some people can get ECT, does that mean that you can get your brain fully erased?
Could you clarify what you mean by ECT?
It's controlled electric therapy to like delete some memories from your brain.
That's an interesting question. So I'm not familiar with ECT. I'm more familiar with a process called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so that's a treatment that people use for treating trauma. And so if somebody's experienced some kind of traumatic event, like a car crash or something, and they're having a lot of nightmares and a lot of physical and emotional problems after that event, EMDR is a way of stimulating each side of the brain in sequence and helping people relive those memories so they can process through it. So it's not that it's erasing memories, but it's changing how we deal with those memories. And of course, there's that age-old question of if we could erase memories, should we or why would we? There's been several movies and books on that topic about if we wanted to erase the bad things that happened to us, because it really changes who we are.
Awesome, great question. Let's get one more question from the French American School, and then we'll visit in with our other on-camera school. What's your question, friend?
Do TV screens destroy our brains? Why do people say that?
Why do people say, I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
Do TV screens destroy our brains?
Okay, I love it. That's a good question. We hear that a lot. I feel like my husband and I have said that to our child too, about don't sit in front of the TV too much. And there's a couple of things that happen with screens. So the first is that some people use screens to check out. They don't want to deal with what's going on in the world. They'd rather sit and look at their phone or their iPad or their Kindle or the computer or the TV. And so it can be a what's called a negative coping mechanism. People are trying to hide from something or they don't feel good, and so they go to their screen instead. And one of the problems with screens in particular, a lot of flashing screen, it changes the neurotransmitters in your brain. And so that's part of why it makes people feel good, is all those flashing lights, it stimulates our brain. And that's also why things like social media can be very addictive. So we think about cigarettes as being bad and addictive. We think about things like alcohol as being potentially addictive, but social media, because it's causing these dopamine rushes, that's one of the chemicals in our brains, it makes us want more of it. And so that's part of the hazards. That's why some people say it melts your brain. It's because it can be a negative coping mechanism, and because it can be very addictive because of the way it causes our chemicals to change in our brain.
All right. Awesome question. Thank you for all those questions. We're now going to invite Kiffin Elementary on screen. That was a great first batch of questions. I'm sure we'll have some more interesting curiosities coming up from Kiffin. Let's see here. There you are. All right. Hey, friend, what's your question?
Why does the brain let you forget things that you should remember?
Ah, that's a good one. So forgetting is a normal process that happens in our brains. So remember, we keep talking about those neurons, and if it's a very durable memory, and we look inside the brain, like if we could zoom in, we would see that there's a bunch of neurons tightly connected there and a very strong connection. If you don't reinforce things, you lose them. And so if we don't reinforce those connections go away. And that's when we forget something. So we either have not reinforced the connection or we haven't actually moved that information in a long-term memory.
All right, awesome. All right, what's our next question from the classroom at Kiffin Elementary?
How does your brain form dreams and nightmares?
That's a really good question. This came up earlier. So how does the brain form dreams and nightmares? So what happens in the brain while we sleep? And so sleep is really, really important for learning because it's the part where we consolidate our memories and our experiences from that day. And so people don't know exactly why we dream or why sometimes we can have very fantastical dreams. But it has something to do with being able to consolidate those memories, getting rest in, and kind of wrapping up the day so that we're refreshed the next morning. That's why it's so important to get a good night's sleep the day before an exam. I also will have students say, oh, Dr. Peffer, what do we need to do to get ready for this exam? What should I be doing over the weekend? And I almost always tell them that they need to rest. Because if you haven't learned it by that point, you're probably not going to learn it very effectively. And so one of the best things you can do is just rest so that your brain is in the best shape possible to be able to respond. When we're tired, it causes a lot of a hormone called cortisol to be released. And it really gets in the way of learning and how our brain is functioning. So we want to not have stress when we go into our exams.
All right, great question. Yeah, keep them rolling, Kiffin.
How do our brains form?
Oh, this is a really good question. This is actually something I studied when I was in graduate school, was how the brain forms. So I could probably go on for about an hour and just talk about how the brain forms. The key things to know are that we all develop from a single cell. And the first thing that happens is that we get a bunch of identical cells. And then those cells get their jobs. And so the first thing that happens is it divides into 3 different layers. You don't even know what the names of those layers are. And one of those layers is fated to have the cells that are going to become part of the brain. And then so as cells, as they divide, they get closer and closer to what their final job is going to be. So if you've heard of stem cells, a stem cell is a cell that doesn't have its job yet. And then so eventually those cells get more specialized. And so we have the cells that will become the brain. And then they get more specialized to be specific cells. And so we still have some stem cells in our brain, such as in the hippocampus, which is where we make our new memories. But early on in development, there's a lot more stem cells there.
All right, fantastic questions. Let's get another one from Kiffin Elementary. What's your question, friend?
What happens when your brain gets confused?
That's a really good question. What happens when we get confused? I think it depends on why we were confused. Because sometimes people get confused when they hear something that's different from something they already know. And then the brain's trying to make sense of, well, is it this or is it that? And so that's when we might ask a question to be like, hey, I had heard that Pluto was a planet, and now you're telling me that Pluto is not a planet. So what's going on here? So that can be part of confusion. It's just not quite knowing what's going on or not being able to orient ourselves.
All right, great. Let's get one more question from Kiffin Elementary, and then we'll start to wrap up our program today. What's your question, friend?
What's your favorite part about having your job?
Oh, what's my favorite part about my job? There's a couple of things I would say. One is that I get to learn. I love that as a scientist that I'm always learning new things. That's probably my favorite part about my job. Another one of my favorite parts about my job is that I have a little bit more flexibility than other people do. So being a scientist, at least at a university, I get to have more flexibility and I get to travel. And what that means is that I get to see a lot of different parts of the world. And I get to meet people from all around the world, which I also really, really love, is learning about different cultures. And I get to do it as a mom. So I have 2 little boys. They are the center of my world. But I was at a scientific meeting at the beginning of November and they both got to go. And so I was going and meeting people and learning new things, which I love to do. And then I would get to go have lunch with them. So I get to spend time with my kids and then go back to learning new things and sharing my ideas and meeting new people. And it was just so much fun. And so I love that my kids get to be a part of my job. And as soon as this broadcast is over, I'm going to go have lunch with my youngest, who happens to be at the museum with me today.
All right. Well, that is delightful. That is awesome. So at this point, thank you so much, Kiffin Elementary, for those questions. We're going to start wrapping up our program now. My last question to you, Dr. Peffer, is what words of wisdom or advice or just closing thoughts do you have for our learners today?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to express my gratitude for all of you being here today, for your teachers making this happen. I'm so glad that you could come out today and we could share some time together. So my best advice kind of goes hand in hand both with my career story as well as with Kale from the beginning of my talk today. And it's about being curious and following your passions. So there's always going to be someone who says, you can't do that. No one's ever done that before. And if it's really something you care about, go for it. Because at the end of the day, the best scientists are the ones that can make those new connections and be creative. And so be curious, follow your passions, and don't let people say no, that you can't do that. It's just because it hasn't been done before, doesn't mean you can't be the first person to do it. So always go for it, because if you follow your passions, then it won't ever feel like work. It will just be fun every day.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, many thanks to our classrooms that joined us on camera. Thank you to all our friends that joined us for this edition of Scientists in Action. Of course, a huge thanks to Dr. Melanie Peffer. Thank you for sharing your passion, curiosity, and expertise with us. Thanks to Kim, Riley, and Kate behind the scenes helping to make this whole production happen. So we hope you had a wonderful time with us, and we hope that you'll join us again in January when we have a program, a virtual voyage through the universe. So today we explored inner space, and next month we will be exploring outer space. And thank you so much again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.